We will now move on to the question and answer session. So we already received several questions, and there are the group of policy-related questions, particularly the trade-off, policy trade-off you referred at the last part of your talk. So I bundle them together. And so the first question combines the three separate questions, but related to the policy.
Just to be clear, you're seeing different questions than I'm seeing. Is that the
I
way
see.
it's supposed to work?
I think the first question is that the white paper on labor economy in Japan suggests that 1% increase in the wages for all workers would result in an increase of approximately 2.2 trillion yen in production and about 0.5 trillion yen in employee compensation. What do you think about this analysis? And this is, I think, related to the other question, which says that does the minimum wage affect inflation as well as employment? Is it likely that raising minimum wage will accelerate inflation by stimulating demand from low-income workers? Could you share your insight on this? And the last one is also related to the productivity question. Raising the minimum wage might lead to an increase in workers' skill or provide them with the incentive to upskill, thereby boosting overall labor productivity and potentially having a positive impact on the economy as a whole. What are your thoughts on this possibility? So those are the related questions,
Sure.
I think.
They're sort of related, but okay. So let me start with the ones that are easier to answer. Inflation. We actually have a chapter on that in our book, Washer and I. Minimum wages do raise prices in industries where minimum wage workers are employed. You want to think about the phrase that's often used is pass-through, right? If I run a restaurant and I have a lot of low-wage workers and therefore low-wage labor is part of my cost, not my only cost. I pay rent, I have other costs. When the minimum wage goes up, I'm almost certain to, and the data says this, pass through some of that cost into higher prices. The best evidence on that I'm aware of is actually probably for the restaurant industry, partly because we get a lot of data on prices at restaurants, including creative ways people have collected those data, and partly because restaurants have a lot of low-wage labor. That elasticity, I haven't kept up on that literature. It's probably in the 0.1 to 0.15 range, so a 10% increase in the minimum raised prices by 1 to 1.5%. Now remember, it's not the full amount of the minimum wage because low-wage labor is not 100% of your costs. Does it create inflation? Well, no, but this may reflect a common misunderstanding of inflation. When economists say inflation, we mean the rate of growth of prices. So when the minimum wage goes up, it will lead to a one-time increase in some prices, but there's no reason to think if prices have gone up and stay up without coming down, inflation can be zero. So I'm not concerned about inflation from minimum wage increases, although some prices will go up. I mean, when I go out for, what I consider a cheap meal, a lunch sandwich, whatever, in San Francisco, where the minimum wage, I think, is now over $16, if I'm not mistaken, it costs a lot more than it does in Tennessee, where my daughter used to live, where the minimum wage is less than half that. So these things are reflected in prices, and you see that, but that is different from inflation. But it does help reinforce the point I made that there's always a trade-off. The minimum wage doesn't come from nowhere. When the minimum wage goes up for an employer, why would you think that an employer would only raise the wage, which they have to by law, and not make other adjustments? They might raise prices. They might obviously reduce staff. They might make the portions a little smaller. There's a lot of things they can do. And some of those include prices going up, and some of those include fewer jobs. The second question started with, does a minimum wage create incentives to get more skills? And then there was the second part, which I'll put off for a minute, which does that lead to higher output? Let me just talk about the skill question. So that's something on which there is, a reasonable amount of research, nothing like the size of the employment effects. If I put all the studies together on the graph, like I showed you before, all of those bars, there'd be, probably 10 or 12 studies instead of 70 studies and hundreds of estimates. That research doesn't find minimum wages increase skills, and if anything, points a little in the opposite direction. So if you think about it, how does the minimum wage affect skill? We can think there's really two channels, right? One is it can affect people's schooling decisions. Okay, right off the bat, you think about that, and it's actually ambiguous, right? So I'm a kid in high school, and I may be deciding whether to drop out, or I'm deciding whether to go to college or not. So the minimum wage goes up. On the one hand, I might look at the labor market and say, it's harder to get a job. I have to have higher productivity or employers won't hire me. That might incentivize me to stay in school and increase my skills. On the other hand, I see higher wages out there, and I might say, hey, I'm going to quit school and start looking for a job, and I might still find one. And that leads to lower levels of skills. So that could go either way. The other places skills come from is employer training. And there, it's a little more complicated, but in some cases, when employers have to pay for the training, they're probably going to do less of it after a minimum wage goes up because the worker now actually costs them more. And at least in the US, you cannot offset the minimum wage with training costs. I can't say I get to pay you $1 less than the minimum wage because I'm spending $1 on training. Okay, so that sort of takes us to the third question, which I don't know this white paper clearly, but the argument that a higher minimum wage boosts spending and output. This is an argument you used to see in the United States from some advocates for higher minimum wages. I don't think you see it anymore, and I think almost no one believes it. So if all you think that happens is magically some low-skilled workers have more wages, then there is more money in the economy and there is more spending and output will go up. But that money comes from somewhere. Somebody's paying it. If there's higher prices, some people demand a little less. If some businesses close or fewer businesses open, and there's evidence for both of those, then output shrinks. The one argument why a minimum wage could boost the economy is that low-income people spend a higher share of their income than high-income people do. They have what's called a higher marginal propensity to consume. So I assume it's true in Japan too, it's certainly true in most places, that people who earn higher incomes have a higher savings rate. So in the short run, if you take $1 from me and give it to a poor person, they might spend the whole $1 because they don't save much. I might spend 92 cents because I invest. So in the short run, you might get a stimulus boost from that. Of course, in the longer run, my investment leads to more capital and a larger economy. So in the long run, that effect wouldn't apply anyways. I think I answered all those questions.
Yes, thank you very much. So the second question is on the effect of minimum wage on family formation. So the audience says that raising minimum wages of young and stabilizing employment is important from the perspective of supporting the marriage of those who desire it. What do you think about it?
It's an interesting hypothesis. I don't know of any evidence. I would say a couple things. I do think that economic prospects of people matters for marriage, and poor prospects can reduce incentives to marry. I would note this question says raising the wages of the young and stabilizing employment might boost marriage. So if I get both increased wages and employment, this might happen. But I don't think that happens. I think you increase wages and lower employment. So there's some trade-off there.
Oh, yeah.
I'm also, I don't know the Japanese context, but certainly in the U.S., what are the estimates? Something like half of minimum wage workers are underage, 24 or under. Minimum wages are not exclusively, but very much a teenage phenomenon. Why? Because teenagers are really low skilled because they don't know anything yet. I mean, if we went to work when we were teenagers, no one would have paid us much either because we didn't have any skills. So I don't know if wages at those ages have that much impact on family formation. Okay. That said, it's a challenge, and governments all over the world, I think, are interested in boosting marriage and in some cases fertility as well, and don't really know what to do.
Okay. The next question I would like to ask is regarding the industry-specific minimum wage. It's a second question from the top. Do you think it is effective to raise the minimum wage in specific industries?
So if effective means more benefits, I'm not quite sure what that would mean. I would say there's no reason, if a government, as almost all governments do, thinks there should be a minimum wage. I mean, there's minimum wages in many, many, many countries, poor and rich, across the world. If a government has decided that it wants minimum wage floors of some kind, it might make a lot of sense for them to vary by industry. I do think what you should take away from the research I discussed today is, as I said right at the end, there's a trade-off, right? Minimum wages obviously pay some workers higher wages. Some workers are better off, but some may lose their jobs. So if you nonetheless think you want a higher minimum wage, whatever the reason is, and there may be many, you want to think about some balancing act. So just like in the United States, it makes perfect sense that minimum wages are higher in California than in Mississippi because wages are a lot higher in California. So it also would make sense to say, geez, a higher wage industry can afford a higher minimum wage than a low wage industry. Think about a manufacturing plant and a restaurant. So the restaurant, a lot of the work are a retail store. In the retail store, the restaurant, a lot of the workers may be very low wage workers. If you raise the minimum wage a lot, you're raising labor cost a lot because a lot of the labor cost is low wage labor. It's going to be affected by the minimum. And probably a lot of the overall costs are labor because those are somewhat labor intensive places. A manufacturing plant will have a lot of workers for whom the minimum wage is irrelevant because they earn a lot more. And maybe there's the people who clean the bathrooms or clean the factory at the end of the day, or maybe a few of the workers doing the very least skilled jobs who earn the minimum wage. And raising the minimum wage, let's say by the same amount for that firm, won't do nearly as much. If the minimum wage increase raises the restaurant's total cost by 20% and the factory's total cost by 1%, there's going to be less response. There's going to be less job loss, perhaps none. So once you've embarked on a minimum wage strategy, it makes sense to think about some balance. Now, Japan, you do it by region to some extent. There's no reason not to think about doing it by industry as well. It might be a political mess, but as an economic matter, not a bad idea.
Okay, thank you very much. We are kind of running out of time, and the last question is referring to the graph of the estimate of the minimum wage, effect of minimum wage on employment, and two related questions on your graph, the graph on the page 14, which is the graph of the estimates. And the one is that what happens if these estimates are weighted by the importance of the research, which is measured by the number of citations. The other question is the concern about the publication bias. Mm-hmm. So that if the only statistically significant figures are published, then this figure could be biased. Right. What is your view on this issue?
Right. So the first issue, let me just that question came from a researcher, I'm pretty sure. So let me just explain a little bit. Weighted by you said weighted by importance, but then you said citation. So in other words, a study that doesn't get cited much, maybe we shouldn't believe it as much, and a study that gets cited a lot, maybe we should believe a lot. I haven't done that calculation. I'm not sure it's the right calculation because citations doesn't necessarily mean right. No. When someone writes a paper that gets famous, then a lot of people decide to critique it. It gets a lot of citations. Publication bias is a potentially real problem, and the idea here is, and every graduate student will attest to this. When they come in with a paper and they say, "Oh, I have this great idea, but I don't get a significant result, I'll never be able to publish it. I don't think it's as true as they think it is, but there's something to it. However, the research literature on minimum wages doesn't really find it. The two most recent papers, there's one by Bellman and Wolfson, or Wolfson and Bellman, in a journal called Labor, which concludes very, very weak evidence of publication bias. And then there's a paper by Casey, and I can't remember if there's a co-author or not, in the American Economic Review, that looks at publication bias in 3 different literatures. One of them is minimum wages. I don't remember sitting here what the other 2 were. And they conclude there's not any evidence of publication bias in terms of the estimates. There is some in terms of significance. So that would suggest this figure is at least on that second dimension, not problematic.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm afraid that we are running out of time. And although we have lots of interesting questions on the Q&A box, but I'm afraid I cannot ask those questions. I'm very sorry. And so it's a time to close the webinar. And thank you very much, Professor Neumark. Thank you very much for your participation in our BBL webinar today. That concludes today's BBL webinar. Thank you for participation. Thank you, Professor Neumark.
Thank you.